The howling winds carried the scent of ash and brimstone across a landscape that had once been lush and hospitable. Now, ash clouds rolled across fields of blackened lava, and the sky was a perpetual swirl of gray. In the decades since the Earth's resources had run dry, communities splintered and only the most tenacious survivors remained. Pockets of humanity clustered in makeshift settlements, always on the verge of starvation, thirst, or exposure to toxins that seep through the ground. Everywhere one turned, scorched mountains and molten fissures loomed like impending doom, constant reminders that beneath their feet lay an immense, untapped power. Fuel, once so abundant it seemed impossible to ever run out, was now the scarcest treasure in the world. Oil fields were exhausted, solar panels broken or out of reach, and remnants of technology existed only in scattered scraps that no one entirely understood. Stories spread of a place where the magma churned close to the surface, a volcanic field so active that one could practically harvest the Earth's raw energy. For many, it sounded like a last-ditch hope. For others, it was a white-hot invitation to destruction. Malia stood on a rugged outcropping high above her settlement, scanning the horizon with a grin set to her jaw. She was no stranger to risk. Her parents had once tried to make a living scavenging parts from abandoned factories, hoping to restart the old machines that had kept civilization afloat. But they'd never returned from a venture into the southern wastelands, leaving Malia to raise her younger brother, Aaron, on half rations and second-hand knowledge. Despite the hardships, she carried on their legacy of technical tinkering, piecing together fragments of old schematics that promised a means of extracting geothermal power, but the handful of small geysers near the settlement weren't enough. Each spout fizzled out within months of being tapped, a cruel tease of a solution. Now, rumors of towering volcanic spires and ever-present lava streams had stirred a glimmer of desperate hope among the settlement's leaders. If the rumors were true, a properly built rig could tap directly into the Earth's fiery core, providing abundant energy. Malia had volunteered to join the expedition team, a mix of engineering dreamers and hardened survivalists, to chase that hope despite the danger. She descended from the outcropping into the cluster of shacks where the rest of the expedition waited. Gray soot coated every surface, including the tiny patch of earth that some still tried to cultivate for meager plants. Aaron leaned against one of the charred walls, arms crossed, dark hair clinging to his forehead in sweat-damp strands. At 19, he was as lean as a scavenger dog, but carried an unmistakable spark in his eyes. He had begged to accompany his sister, though Malia initially refused to risk his life, but the council had insisted on his labor. Both sets of hands were needed. He loaded up the mechanical equipment while exchanging nervous glances with the rest of the crew. A man named Rusk, broad-shouldered and sporting a prosthetic arm constructed from scavenged steel tubes, was overseeing the expedition. He was tough and practical, having fought off raider clans in past resource skirmishes. Beside Rusk stood Maya coincidentally, sharing Malia's name except for a slight difference in spelling. A pale and wiry woman who'd supposedly studied geology in the last existing university, back when an education in science was still possible. Malia spoke in clipped, precise sentences, rarely wasting words. Malia could tell that the woman was eager to see the volcanic fields for herself, no doubt craving the chance to prove her expertise. They set out at dawn, forging across black plains pocked with lifeless craters. The dust storms stung at their eyes, the taste of volcanic ash souring their tongues. Each traveler wore goggles and tattered face masks to keep from inhaling the toxic air. Even so, their breath came in heavy gasps, and the trek felt endless. Ancient roads, cracked by seismic shifts, only occasionally offered guidance. Sometimes they stumbled upon abandoned vehicles. Rusted shells, half submerged in hardened lava, told stories of those who had tried to harness the power of the volcanoes before the expedition. They discovered twisted pipes and drilling rods that never reached deep enough, or else they'd read cryptic messages scrawled on half-melted metal. Final words left by those who perished from miscalculation or pure misfortune. On the evening of the second day, they caught their first glimpse. The horizon burned vibrant red. Not a sunrise or sunset, but the dull aura of molten rock spitting skyward. Thick plumes of smoke rose continuously, obscuring the stars. Malia felt a strange mixture of awe and dread. Their group arranged a makeshift camp beneath a looming basalt cliff. With the wind at their backs, they huddled around battery-powered lanterns. Rusk distributed rations, stale crackers augmented by a watery soup that Malia recognized as barley, and some dried tubers. Aaron, hungry from carrying the heavy drilling rig all day, wolfed down his share. There was conversation here and there, speculative talk about how far the lava flows might extend, and quiet anxieties about what lurked within those scorching fields. Though no one spoke it aloud, each wondered if the effort would be worth the potential catastrophe. The volcanic field promised immeasurable power, but it was also a sleeping beast. Sunrise arrived in a haze of toxic orange, matching the swirling fumes floating from the volcanic vents. The approach to the main vent was treacherous. Rivers of semi-solid lava carved jagged paths across the ground, forcing them to detour repeatedly. Every so often the ground rumbled, prompting everyone to crouch low and brace themselves. Steam hissed from cracks, occasionally blasting scalding vapor into the air. One moment they'd be skirting a cooled lava mound, the next they'd have to leap across a hot rivulet. At last, Maya raised a slender arm and pointed across a deep fissure. Less than a mile away, a massive crater seethed with molten rock, oozing and spitting in violent bursts. The surrounding land shimmered in the heat. For a moment, the group simply stared. Aaron's voice, hoarse from inhaling volcanic dust, broke the silence. "This place? It looks like an open wound." No one contradicted him. Between the roiling magma and the charcoal sky, the crater might as well have been a wound on a dying planet. Rusk wiped soot from his goggles. "We'll need to find a vantage point to set up. We can't drill right there in the crater. We need to plan carefully." Malia nodded, recalling half-faded diagrams from her parents. Too close to the lava, and the ground would be too unstable. But approach from the wrong angle, and the drilling rig would never punch through. Every decision held life or death consequences. They followed a gradually sloping path along the crater's edge, sometimes slipping on loose gravel that fell towards searing rock below. Malia's palms grew slick with sweat, but not all of it stemmed from the heat. She could almost sense the earth's fury pulsing underfoot like a living thing. During brief rests, she fiddled with the components for a smaller test rig, ensuring she'd be ready once they found a stable spot. After hours of tense searching, they arrived at a ledge of basalt that rose above the lava flows. Steam vents hissed from an area a short distance away, an indication that geothermal power might be just beneath. Malia removed the small test rig from her pack, setting it carefully on the rocky ground. About the size of a thick metal pole with an attached sensor array, it was meant to confirm if a deeper, safer drilling operation could commence. If the sensor confirmed that the heat level was ideal, they'd anchor the real drilling rig and begin tapping magma flows that promised enough energy to transform the settlement's future. As Malia finished calibrating the test rig, the ground shook violently. A minor eruption rippled lava to the surface, creating a spray of molten droplets that arced against the ashen sky. Rusk barked a command to take cover. They pressed into the basalt outcropping, hearing the sizzling ping of molten rock striking stone. For a terrifying moment, Malia was certain they would be covered in erupting magma. But the torrent receded. The air settled again into a tension-laden hush, interrupted only by the distant hiss of steam. Slowly they emerged. Malia's test rig was partially knocked over but still intact. She hoisted it upright and resumed the calibration, exhaling with immense relief to see that it remained functional. Though the immediate crisis passed, the day's tension lingered. Rusk decided they would sleep several yards away from the ledge, just far enough to avoid a sudden spew of lava. They arranged their gear into a defensive circle, less out of fear of animals, since so few survived in this toxic domain, but more from a sense that they should keep watch. Here, on the threshold of the Earth's searing energy, anything could happen. Maya took out a battered notebook and scribbled data about seismic activity, heat levels, and the mineral composition in her crisp, terse handwriting. Maya watched her, torn between admiration for the woman's scientific enthusiasm and the unsettled worry that science might not be enough to tame such violent natural forces. The next morning they started building the actual rig. They'd brought scavenged metal rods and gears, plus a powerful but finicky motor that ran off the last dregs of fuel cells the settlement possessed. If all worked as planned, the rig would perforate the rock to reach a channel of superheated steam. They couldn't drill directly to magma, nobody had that kind of technology anymore, but they could channel the heat to drive turbines, at least that was the theory. They anchored the base deep into the basalt using industrial spikes, hammered by Rusk and Aaron working in tandem. Each clang of metal on rock echoed like a warning or a curse, and each spike sank deeper into the ground that belched steam and threatened to rend itself apart at any moment. Progress was literally excruciating. The stifling heat made them weary, and the scorching dust seared exposed skin. Even with face coverings, they occasionally coughed from the sulfuric fumes. Malia's eyes burned from sweat mixed with ash. Sometimes she glimpsed red flashes of lava in the corner of her eye. She caught Aaron watching the crater with undisguised fear, though he tried to hide his trembling hands. At midday, Maya checked the rig's alignment with the level that had survived generations, carefully turning knobs on the motor's housing. Malia fine-tuned the sensor arrays, hoping they could transmit at least some data back to the settlement with the battered radio transmitter. All the while, Rusk kept a vigilant watch for signs of tremors. He was certain that another eruption loomed. If it occurred at the wrong moment, the entire venture would be lost, and likely all their lives as well. Late that afternoon, Aaron trudged over to Malia, a dark look in his eyes. "Something feels wrong," he muttered. "The rig's only half assembled, and I swear I can feel the heat building underfoot." Malia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We have to push forward. If we go back now, we'll return empty-handed. The settlement's on the brink, you know that." He swallowed, nodding reluctantly. "I just hope we're not sealing our own fate." Malia understood his anxiety, but desperation drove them on. This was bigger than them. It was about survival for thousands in the settlement. She turned away and pulled the lever that engaged the motor for a test spin. The drilling head spun with a shriek of metal, vibrating so violently that Malia feared it might tear itself apart. She winced, but saw that it managed to retain some semblance of stability. White-hot sparks occasionally shot from the contact point where metal bit into basalt. Steam hissed more aggressively, and the temperature rose. They had begun their assault on the earth. Over the next few days, they systematically pressed the drill deeper. Groaning metal rods ground through layers of rock, exposing veins of glimmering minerals. Sometimes pockets of superheated steam exploded upward. Each time, the team scrambled to get clear, hearts hammering with the panic that the entire contraption might blow if a vent pressurized too quickly. Despite hardship after hardship, they pushed on. The settlement had staked everything on this expedition. The last functioning rig, the final fuel cells, and the talents of people like Malia and Maya. Rusk allowed them only the barest rests, encouraging them with gruff words that they were on the brink of literal pay dirt. If they succeeded, the settlement's future would be secured. Farmers could power irrigation systems, medics could run advanced equipment, travelers could operate vehicles to scavenge more effectively. Building that kind of hope kept them from being crushed by the weight of each new obstacle. On the 6th day, while the sun was hidden behind a choking pall, the ground convulsed in the strongest quake they'd felt. The crater's rim spewed molten spouts with terrifying force, raining smoldering chunks that burst into the air like hellish fireworks. A boulder of half-molten rock crashed near the rig, sending chunks of basalt and sizzling magma spatters in all directions. Malia lunged aside, feeling the heat sear the edge of her coat. She yelled for Aaron to find cover. Amid the chaos, she glimpsed Rusk, face contorted, as he attempted to brace the rig. The motor whined, trying to continue drilling despite the violent shaking. Maya and Aaron crouched behind a jagged rock face, arms shielding their heads. Then came a deafening crack, the sound of the basalt ledge fracturing. In a horrible instant, the portion of the ledge on which the rig was anchored plummeted several feet into a fresh sinkhole. The motor assembly jerked, twisted, and threatened to implode. Rusk hollered at Malia to shut it down, but sparks flew and the control panel erupted in a swirl of smoke. Malia could barely see through the haze, choking on the acrid fumes. She groped for the emergency shutoff lever. Another quake rolled through, launching her painfully against a metal crossbeam. Stars burst in her vision, and she bit back a cry. Finally, her fingers found the lever, yanking it with all her strength. The rig sputtered and coughed before going still, but not before releasing a final hiss of steam that scorched the air. "Get out of there!" Rusk bellowed. Blood trickled down his forehead, and he limped toward her. Beyond him, shards of basalt continued to tumble into the crater. Malia scrambled away from the edge, her lungs aflame from inhaling too much toxic air. Aaron rushed forward, hooking an arm around her waist to help her stand. Maya followed, her notebook lost in the rubble but her face resolute. Together they made it to safer ground, only to watch in horror as nearly a quarter of the outcropping collapsed into the lava below. The rig teetered precariously on the new ledge, half buried in debris. Metal rods gave a tortured screech before the entire structure toppled sideways, wedged in a diagonal across a newly formed chasm. Rusk sank to his knees, cursing under his breath. The moment they'd pinned all their hopes on now hung in catastrophic limbo. Smoke stung their eyes as they regrouped. Over the next hours they tried desperately to salvage the rig. The motor seemed irreparably damaged, but the harness and some of the rods remained workable. Malia and Maya examined the drilling tip, which was lodged deep in volcanic rock, while Rusk and Iran devised a plan to retrieve it using makeshift pulleys. Eventually, they pried free important components, gear assemblies, sensor arrays, and the battered control panel. But the integrity of the main structure was compromised beyond immediate repair. The crater's fury refused to settle. A constant flow of molten spires and blasts of steam. Every passing minute felt like a death sentence if they stayed out in the open. Late that night, they huddled around a dim lantern, defeat evident in their slumped shoulders. The ground still vibrated with aftershocks. Malia fiddled absently with the sensor array, brushing ash from its circuits. It was mostly intact, but useless without the rig's motor. The group knew returning to the settlement empty-handed now posed a devastating blow. "We can't drill without that rig," Maya said in a rare moment of vocal frustration. "Even if we manage to scavenge everything, we don't have the parts to rebuild." Rusk slammed a fist into the ground. "We're so close to the heat pockets. If only we could channel the steam somehow." Malia blinked and gazed at the half-crumbled ledge. Wait, the new sinkhole. It exposed an under-channel. She remembered glimpsing an opening in the rock when the outcropping collapsed. If there was a partially formed network of volcanic tubes or vents, maybe it could funnel steam directly to a turbine, skipping the step of drilling. It was a wild idea, but it might be their only shot. They agreed to risk exploring the sinkhole at sunrise. When the sky lightened to a toxic gray, they carefully climbed down, navigating heaps of broken basalt. The sinkhole opened into a twisting corridor of lava tubes, illuminated by faint red glows beneath the rock. The air was blisteringly hot, forcing them to wrap their faces and ration their oxygen. Still, they pressed onward. Malia led the way, sensor array in hand. Maya followed closely, shining her headlamp on the tunnel walls, etched with mineral deposits. Once, steam gushed from a side passage so fiercely that they were forced to flatten themselves against the opposite wall to avoid being boiled alive. Step by step, they descended deeper, following the sensor's readings until the rock overhead trembled with the planet's heartbeat. They emerged in a natural cavern, radiant with the glow of molten rock seeping through cracks. It was like standing inside a furnace. In the center of the cavern, a funnel-shaped opening bubbled with searing water charged by geothermal heat. Great hisses and sizzling pops echoed, revealing a powerful vent that rose from the bowels of the volcano. Malia's sensor beeped wildly, indicating intense temperatures, but also a stable enough channel that could theoretically be harnessed if they could attach piping or a structure over that vent. Malia's eyes gleamed with realization. They still had the rig's rods and partial harness back at camp. If they could anchor a makeshift turbine here, they might capture enough energy to power a transmission back to the settlement, prove this location viable, and then plan a larger-scale operation. That night, in the relative shelter of the lava tube entrance, they worked feverishly. Aaron and Rusk assembled a framework from the salvaged rods. Malia and Maya rigged the sensor array to a small turbine disk they'd extracted from the drilling apparatus. They lacked specialized tools, so they improvised by hammering metal joints with rocks, welding edges using the natural molten heat of the environment itself. Sparks danced across basalt surfaces, flickering like fireflies in the gloom. Every so often the planet rumbled, as though impatient with their meddling. Sweat poured from their brows, their hands blistered, faces streaked with grime, but in the slow, agonizing hours, a rough contraption took shape. Before dawn, they carefully lugged the contraption back to the cavern and positioned it atop the funnel of scalding water. They anchored it with metal spikes hammered into the rock, using the same precarious knowledge gleaned from half-remembered engineering texts. Malia and Maya worked side by side to ensure the turbine's disk would catch the rising steam, spin, and generate at least a modest current. When Aaron made the final connection from the turbine to the battered control panel, everything went still. Only the drip of condensation and the roar of subterranean heat filled the silence. "Ready?" Malia asked, voice trembling with exhaustion. Rusk gave a solemn nod. "Throw it, kid." Malia flipped the improvised switch. For an agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then came a low hum, followed by the whir of the turbine disk spinning as pressurized steam shot upward. Sparks flickered around the rig's base. The control panel clicked ominously. Suddenly, a pale green light ignited on the sensor array. A test lamp they had attached flickered to life, and a faint beam of light shone across the cavern's walls. It was a humble, flickering illumination, but in this gloom it felt like the sun itself. Aaron let out a disbelieving laugh. Maya stared at the little light, eyes shining with a mixture of scientific fascination and raw relief. Rusk, always stoic, broke into an involuntary grin. Malia felt tears burn at her eyes as she reached out to steady the contraption. It wasn't the grand drilling operation they had envisioned, but it was enough to prove that harnessing this geothermal pocket was possible. Even better, the rig might transmit a weak but crucial radio signal back to the settlement, letting them know the expedition still lived and had found a source of energy. Later, as the group rested in the tunnel, the faint glow of their newly harvested power shining behind them, they allowed themselves a moment to breathe. Their victory was precarious. Eruptions, quakes, and 100 other perils lay in wait. It could all be destroyed on a whim of the earth. Yet the knowledge remained. A direct line to the fiery core beneath their feet could save them. They only needed the will to expand it, to bring the settlement's best minds and scroungers back here, to fortify and refine this effort. Malia pictured future caravans carrying pipes, turbines, and protective enclosures, converting the raging volcano into a stable power source. It would be a dangerous endeavor, but if successful, entire communities might be revived. A whispering dread still lingered, a sense that the earth might lash out at them for their audacity. But for the first time in ages, they had proof of a resource that wouldn't be burned up in months or years. Overhead, the crater's fury remained, lava streams continuing their relentless flow. But in the bowels of the earth, there was hope, in the form of scalding, pressurized lifeblood that might turn turbines and power the few devices that still functioned. The destruction that had once threatened to consume them became a source of salvation. The ground rumbled one more time, less violently, as though acknowledging their presence. Malia settled against the cavern wall, letting fatigue wash over her. Her eyes flicked to the turbine contraption. The pale glow still flickered. It was enough to light the darkness, at least for tonight. At dawn they emerged from the lava tubes, exhausted but determined. Their ragged group gazed upon the volcanic crater with renewed vision. It was still a churn of lethal fire and toxic smoke, but now they saw possibility woven into the chaos. If they returned with reinforcements, they could build a permanent station. The Earth's ferocity would be harnessed bit by bit, forging a new era for the settlement, an era built on the rocking shoulders of a planet that had endured human mistakes for millennia. They gathered their limited supplies, the sensor data, and the battered components of their primitive turbine, determined to survive the trek back and deliver the news. They set off along the rim, forging a path through the blistered land. The memory of that flickering light in the cavern buoyed them forward. Behind them, the lava fields hissed and bubbled, a primal force that could scorch them without remorse. Yet, they had stood at the threshold of that molten fury and coaxed out a power that might save their people. Steam rose from fissures, carrying an oddly comforting warmth that followed them. The earth still raged, but now Malia felt a stirring of respect, an understanding that they were tapping into something timeless and immeasurable. If used wisely, it could sustain them for decades to come. If misused, it would swallow them whole. They would carry back not only the battered scraps of metal and the sensor readings, but a glimmer of hope. The settlement's future might be precarious, but it was no longer a dead end. Where others had failed, they had persevered, forging a covenant with the planet's molten core. The day arrived bright, though tinted by ash, and for the first time in many years, they believed in a tomorrow that wasn't shaped solely by despair. The path ahead stretched across blackened ground, but it led toward life painted by the furious heartbeat of the earth.